Welcome back. Today, in our second photography lesson, we'll be discussing shape and the rule of thirds. Last time, we discussed how photography is painting with light. And so, our big question became, how can we paint with light in order to capture something of interest, of impact? And so we discussed how one of the things needed to do this is a good sense of the elements of design. One of which is line, and how line can draw a viewer's eye into or out of the frame. It can also cause emotion in a person. But for today, we're going to discuss another element, and that element is shape. How can we use shape to add interest or impact to an image? Shape is really good at doing two things, one of which is communicating. We see shapes every day, and in some way or another, they are telling us something. It may be on our computer or smartphone that we are being given instructions or direction on how to do something. Or they might be shapes on a flag flying in someone's yard, speaking to some deep value that an individual holds. Or they might be shapes that you find on a sign. Signs need to be clearly understood, and so take these for instance. This is a different language and culture than my own, and yet I know precisely what's being communicated here just by looking at the shapes. Along the same lines as communication, shape is also used to identify things. Take the human body shape, for instance. That's something that we clearly recognize and can identify when we see its shape. Or take a look back at this picture of these men playing basketball. Well, wait, how do we know they're playing basketball? If you look, the only detail in this photo is in the sky and in the ocean, and yet we know they're playing basketball? Of course, because the shape is identifying things that we previously understand and have seen before. Now that we know that shape both communicates and identifies things clearly, how can we use this to our advantage as photographers to make our images more interesting? The key for highlighting or drawing out shape in an image is contrast. The idea that we want our shape to be strikingly different than the background. How do we do that? More often than not, the best way to find contrast and use it is by looking at the direction of light in your image. Take this picture for instance. Notice that it is backlit, meaning that the light is coming from behind. In doing this, there is no light on the front of this shape, and so it is a silhouette, or it is highlighted. There is contrast here because it is stark black compared to the colorful and lit up background. Over the summer, my kids were playing in some sprinklers with their friends. I saw one of their friends playing, and I noticed the sun was coming from behind him. I positioned myself so that the light would wrap around his shape, highlighting and drawing out this shape of movement and fun. A few years ago, I had my camera, and I blasted my brother from behind with lights and caught this image. Notice that his profile, the silhouette of his face, is highlighted and that the light lightly wraps around the edges, highlighting that shape of his face. While I was in Southern California saying goodbye to a friend, my wife captured this image. Notice that my friend and I are backlit, and so our shape is being highlighted. Remember what shape does. It communicates, and in this image, I believe that it communicates friendship well. Notice here how the light does not come from behind, and yet the shape is highlighted. We call this front lit. The flower, the subject, is being lit from the front, and yet because the background is not lit, it produces this nice contrasting shape. The direction of light, though, as I stated before, isn't the only way to create contrast. In this image, I was in Nebraska, and I realized that my daughter's neon-colored clothing was contrasting with the pale blue of the sky and the green of the grass. So I lowered myself and positioned her shape right up against the sky and snapped this image, highlighting her shape. In this image, I wanted to highlight the shape of the coffee mug, but instead of using light as my starting point, I thought of the color. This coffee mug is white, and I noticed coffee beans all around it were dark, so I spread them out and filled the cup, and the shape of the coffee mug is now highlighted and featured because of the contrasting color. In this case, both the light, being that the bird was slightly in the shadows and the background was lit, and the color, of course the dark line and the darkness in the bird compared to the colorful background, was what I had thought through in order to capture this image. During an engagement shoot, I wanted to capture the fact that this couple was young, energetic, and had fun together. To do this, I knew that their shape flying through the air would communicate that well, so I placed them against a bland wall and asked them to jump off. Notice that the contrast between the colors and the shape is highlighted or drawn out when compared to the wall. Though elements of design give us good content to capture, where we place those elements and subjects within our frame is just as important. So now let's focus a bit more on composition. Composition being the act of where you decide to place your elements within the frame. Last time, we discussed the composition element of filling the frame. For today's lesson, we're going to focus on the rule of thirds. The rule of thirds is based on the idea that the human eye doesn't always like to see the subject dead center. In fact, sometimes the human eye finds interest when the subject is off to the left or right, or a little above or below the center. Take a look at this grid. Notice that it is broken into thirds, both horizontally and vertically. The idea here is if you place your subject at an intersection of these lines of thirds, or filling a third or 2/3 of this grid, that it will make an interesting composition. Notice what the photographer has done here in this image. The top third is filled with the sky. The bottom 2/3 are filled with the ocean. Notice that horizon line where the ocean meets the sky is right along that top third line. Here is that same image, but recropped so that the horizon line is in the center of the frame. Now, this is completely subjective, but which image is more interesting or pleasing to you? This one, or the original image where the top third is that horizon line? For this image, the photographer has chosen to compose or place the flower, the one that's most in focus, his main subject, at the intersection of the third lines in the bottom right. Here's that rule of thirds grid once more, and here's the image of the flower. Can you see where the photographer decided to place it? Here, the photographer had to make a choice as to where to compose or place their line of vegetables. They decided, as you can see on the round bulbous part, to do it right along that top third line of the rule of thirds grid. For this image from our last lesson, I decided to bring out the shape of the flower by highlighting the contrast between the blue sky and the yellow flower, as well as the direction of the light, which this flower is being backlit. But I needed to make a decision as to where to place that flower within the frame, and so I composed it by placing it at an intersection of the rule of thirds grid. In this image as well, I had to decide where am I going to place this highlighted shape of this flower. I could have put it in the center, but I chose to compose it in such a way that it's in the top right corner of the rule of thirds grid. And so, here's an exercise you can try. Go outside with your camera, find a shape that you see can be highlighted, either by color contrast or light or texture. Take a picture of it with the subject in the center of your frame. Then, recompose your image so that the subject is at the intersection of the rule of thirds grid, or filling a third of the grid or filling 2/3 of the grid. Then, compare the two images and decide for yourself which image you prefer. Some students from my previous photography session inspired me to go out and capture this image. I needed to decide how I would compose it. Should I have the lines draw my eyes and the viewer's eyes to the center of the frame, or to an intersection of the rule of thirds grid? I prefer the image on the right, but really it's up to the viewer and photographer. What do you think? Now, wrapping this all together, when you're out there capturing an image, think about your subject's shape. How will you highlight that shape? Will you use contrast of light, contrast of color against the background, contrast of texture? And then think about where will you place your subject within the frame? In this image, I was capturing this married couple, and I highlighted their shape by positioning myself and them so that the sun was behind them, blowing out the background but really highlighting them. Then I wanted their eyes to be the focus of the photograph, so I positioned their eyes, and really the intersection of their eyes, at an intersection of the lines of the rule of third grid. So all in all, what have we discussed today? Firstly, shape is something that we can use as artists to communicate and identify things within an image. Also, to pull out your shape, contrast is key, whether it's by light or color or texture. Use contrast to draw out that shape. And secondly, we discussed how to compose our subjects within the frame using the rule of thirds, or really suggestion of thirds. and that is breaking our image visually in our minds into thirds, both horizontally and vertically, and placing the subject somewhere within an intersection of or filling a third or 2/3 of the grid. Now, grab your camera, find a shape, highlight it using contrast, place it anywhere within your frame, try it in the center, try it on the rule of thirds grid, and decide for yourself what looks best. But most importantly, have fun.